Martin Luther King Jr. was no doubt the world's best known civil rights leader who fought against racism and injustice peacefully, and he was eventually assassinated for it. Even as a kid, I always appreciated the small insights that I gained from reading and listening to him. Now, leaving aside some theological differences, I think that there's still some Christian principles that he used that I believe are completely at odds with how people are handling issues today. King famously said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children one day will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Now, what he says comes from the Christian teaching that all of us have been made in the image of God. And being made in the image of God doesn't just mean that everyone is equal, but instead it means that everyone has the utmost value and deserves the utmost respect as being created in God's image. Now, when I think about what he said and I look to today, unfortunately, I see almost a reversal of King's teaching today being put forth primarily in politics, and that's influenced culture a lot. Instead of judging people based off of their character, I see modern civil rights movements pushing for things like white guilt, which is telling people that they should actually feel guilty because of the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. I hear people telling me that I ought to feel or think or vote a certain way because of my skin color rather than the content of the political policies. I hear people saying that people like me should be given special treatment because of the color of my skin rather than judging the work that I do on its own merit. On the other hand, I've also personally experienced direct, overt racism in life where people have rejected me simply because of the color of my skin rather than the content of my character. And in reaction to a lot of these politically charged race-based narratives, I see how it's prompted some people to just flat out reject legitimate race-based concerns that blacks have without giving it any serious consideration, simply because politics have packaged many of the issues in such a ridiculous way. So what I see is once again too much emphasis being placed on the color of skin rather than the content of character. Now, although the quote that I just talked about is probably the quote that he's best known for, he also taught other Christian principles that are also at odds with how we think today. Using Jesus as a model, his family handled racial persecution in a way that's at odds with all of our natural instincts. His niece recently told a story about how her family handled the most extreme cases of unjust persecution. She said, "We were also taught that forgiveness must be bestowed willingly, freely, and without conditions. Those were lessons we fell back on many times as we were called on to forgive publicly and sincerely the most heinous of crimes." When Uncle ML was assassinated in 1968, I was 17 years old, and in the restive way of teenagers, I wanted to blame all white people. I wanted to give hate room to grow in my heart. But my mother and father and my grandparents and Uncle ML reminded all of us that hate only begets more hate, and there should not be room in the world for animosity or mistrust or hostility. When my uncle was killed on April 4th, 1968, I remember talking to my daddy about my feelings of hating white people. Daddy rocked me in his arms and he said to me, "White people march with us, they go to jail with us, they pray with us, they live with us, and they die with us. White people didn't kill your uncle, the devil did." The next year I was called to forgive again, not only those still unknown people who had killed my uncle, but now they had killed my father. I had to forgive yet another injustice, including all those that had shrugged off my daddy's death and called it suicide. Then on June 30th, 1974, my beloved grandmother, Alberta King, was murdered while playing the Lord's Prayer on the organ during Sunday services at historic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Back then, I didn't see my broken heart was big enough to forgive and go on loving my fellow men and women, but love and forgiveness were the King family legacy, and while their legacy sometimes feels like a burden, I now see it as a gift. Now think about how extreme forgiveness is in this situation. Not only was her uncle killed by white racists, but so was her dad. And to add insult to injury, they tried to say that her dad's murder was a suicide. So how could they possibly forgive and love these people rather than hate them? The thing that allowed them to forgive was to remember the Christian principles that were given to them. I've talked about this in other videos, but Christians know that God has given us a gift of forgiveness as a free and undeserved gift. It's undeserved and it cost Jesus his life, and it didn't cost us the same. We received it as a free gift, and knowing how much we've been forgiven gives us the currency to be able to radically forgive freely as well. This ties into when King also said, "I've decided to stick with love. Hate is too great of a burden to bear." This makes sense in so many ways that might not be immediately obvious. Here's how I think about it. When someone wrongs you, it costs you something. If not financially, it costs you something emotionally. If someone breaks something that you own, you can either have them pay it back, or you can just absorb the cost and you can pay for it yourself. If you decide to pay for it yourself, then you're choosing to pay for it instead of having them pay for it. But but regardless, the cost has to be paid. The same is true when someone hurts you emotionally. You're left with an emotional debt that needs to be paid. When we decide to make someone pay for the emotional debt, a lot of the time that's called revenge. We're trying to make them pay for that emotional debt that they left us with. The debt has to be paid, and so we can try to make them pay for it by retaliating, or we can just choose not to retaliate and pay the emotional cost ourselves, or absorb that emotional cost ourselves. If we choose to absorb that cost ourselves, that's called forgiveness. As King said, hate is too great of a burden to bear. So even if you're not a Christian, it's still better for you to forgive. If you decide to choose revenge, keep in mind that you may never get it, and if you don't, then you're going to live with that anger and bitterness and frustration for the rest of your life. And while you continue to stay mad and suffer for the actions that they committed against you, they may have already forgotten all about it and moved on already. So in reality, when you refuse to forgive, they still win in the end, because not only did they make you suffer then, but as the years go by, they're still making you suffer, even though they probably aren't even bothered by it at all today. But the thing is, even if you are able to get revenge one day, you won't find yourself loving them more, but instead you'll find yourself hating them more. So even if you do get that revenge that you've been seeking after, that's not going to make you become more of a loving and more of an understanding person. Nourishing those feelings inside of your heart will continue to grow, and they'll ultimately consume you. You'll ultimately become less and less happy rather than become more and more satisfied. So the person that takes the biggest L in the long run is going to be you. Now, as a black man with this platform today, I am incredibly thankful for what Martin Luther King did for equal rights. He set the stage for me to be here with all of you today that don't just see me as a skin color, but instead see me as another person that's equally valuable as you. So in light of Martin Luther King Day, I hope that we can all be reminded of the truth of the Christian message and how, although it's insanely counterintuitive at times, it has the power to radically transform the world into something far better than it is right now. Another counterintuitive teaching of Christianity that changes things for the better is the Christian view of marriage. So go ahead and click on this video to see what I mean. But the next time that you find that someone says that Christianity hasn't done anything good for the world, what are you going to say? What do you mean?